What would you do if the child you mocked on the street turned out to be part of your own family's hidden story? Just imagine this scene for a moment. A wealthy man in a perfectly tailored suit, stepping out of his sleek black Mercedes under the glowing lights of a rainy New York evening. The world sees him as untouchable, powerful, successful, with money to burn. But on that same sidewalk, drenched from the storm, stands a young boy. His name is Ethan. His shoes are worn out, barely holding. Together, his clothes thin against the cold air. He isn't begging. He isn't causing trouble. He's simply trying to survive, clinging to the few newspapers he still has left to sell before the night swallows him whole. And instead of compassion, instead of even the smallest spark of kindness, the man laughs. He mocks the boy's broken shoes, dismissing him as worthless. A moment that feels so small for the millionaire, but for Ethan, it cuts like a knife. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this, where arrogance blinds someone so deeply that they fail to see the humanity standing right in front of them? Stay with me until the end, because what happened just hours later would turn this man's world upside down and reveal a truth he never saw coming. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. The story takes us into the heart of New York City, a place where dazzling skyscrapers cast long shadows over forgotten streets. It's here that two worlds collide. Richard, the wealthy businessman who believes money is the ultimate measure of worth, and Ethan, a homeless orphan whose innocence and resilience tell a very different story about value. Their meeting should have been fleeting, nothing more than a cruel exchange lost in the chaos of the city. But fate had other plans. Richard was no stranger to pride. Raised in comfort, surrounded by privilege, he had learned to measure people not by their hearts, but by their appearance, their success, their wealth. Shoes polished to perfection, watches that glittered under the light, the cars parked in front of his penthouse. All these were signs of who mattered and who didn't. And so, when he looked at Ethan, he didn't see a boy with a story, a soul, or a struggle. He saw only torn laces, cracked souls, and a reflection of what he despised: poverty. But life has a way of exposing truths at the very moment we least expect it. Richard's arrogance didn't just humiliate a child. It planted the seed of a revelation that would shake everything he believed about himself, his family, and even the definition of love. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried in the pages of yesterday. It waits quietly, hidden in the places we least think to look, until the moment comes for it to rise and demand to be seen. Have you ever been through something like that? A situation where the very thing you judged or rejected came back around, revealing a truth that left you speechless. That's exactly where Richard was headed that night, without the faintest clue. As he drove home, smug in his pride, he didn't know that a single object waiting in his mother's house would unravel his confidence, pierce his heart, and confront him with a side of his family's history that he never knew existed. And this object wasn't a letter or a legal document or even a conversation. It was something far more personal, something intimate, something no one ever expects to carry such power. A diary, his mother's diary, and inside its worn leather cover lay a photograph that would change the meaning of everything Richard thought he knew, especially about the boy he had just mocked in the rain. But how could that be? How could a poor orphan's face appear in the private pages of a wealthy woman's diary? What secret could possibly connect a homeless child to one of the richest families in the city? That's the question that haunted Richard as the night unfolded, and it's the mystery that will take us deeper into this story. A story where wealth, arrogance, and hidden truths collide in ways no one saw coming. Because sometimes the ones we look down on are the very ones fate lifts up, placing them in the center of our lives when we least expect it. And for Richard, the revelation waiting in those pages was more than a shock. It was the beginning of a transformation he never imagined he would face. Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you questioning not just Richard's choices, but perhaps even your own. And maybe as you listen to this story unfold, you've already remembered a moment in your own life, something you saw, or maybe even lived, where judgment came before understanding, where appearance clouded the truth. If this thought is stirring something inside you, I'd love for you to share it in the comments below. Your words might connect with someone else watching right now, someone who feels the same way, but hasn't found the courage to express it. This space we're building here isn't just about stories. It's about creating a community where every experience, every voice adds something meaningful. And if you're feeling the weight of this message so far, a simple like on this video is more powerful than you might think. It tells me this story reached you, that it mattered. It also tells the platform to bring these kinds of narratives to more people, people who may need this reminder at just the right moment. Subscribing too is more than just clicking a button. It's choosing to keep walking with me through stories like this. Tales of contrast, of pride and humility, of hidden truths that change everything. Every subscription is a way of saying, yes, I want to keep being part of this journey. And that makes all the difference in keeping this channel alive, growing, and able to bring more of these messages to you and others. So, if this story has already touched something within you, take a second now, leave your thoughts below, give this video a like, and subscribe if you want to continue traveling through these lessons with me, because together we're not just telling stories, we're reminding each other of the things that truly matter. And as for Richard, he still has no idea what's waiting for him inside that diary, no clue that the next page he turns will force him to face a truth that even money can't protect him from. Richard lived in a world built on marble floors and glass towers, a life where every corner sparkled with luxury and every choice was measured. In dollars, in the heart of Manhattan, his name carried weight. Business partners admired him, rivals envied him, and employees feared him. To Richard, this was the natural order of things. He was the man who had climbed higher than most could ever dream, and from that height, he rarely looked down. His mornings began not with an alarm clock, but with the hum of a private elevator carrying him to the top floor of his penthouse, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Central Park that seemed more like a painting than reality. He polished his life the way one polishes a luxury car. Every detail mattered. His shoes, Italian leather and always shining. His suits, cut to perfection by a tailor in Midtown. His watch, a piece of machinery so intricate it seemed more like a statement of power than a way to keep time. For Richard, appearances weren't just appearances. They were the foundation of his identity. He believed the world was divided into two types of people, those who wore success like armor and those who failed to keep up. I worked for this, Richard often said, gazing into the mirror before heading out to conquer the day, and anyone who can't do the same has only themselves to blame. It wasn't arrogance in his eyes, it was truth. He carried this mindset into every boardroom, every social gathering, and even onto the streets. If someone couldn't prove their worth with material signs of success, then in Richard's view, they simply didn't count. Behind the wheel of his black Mercedes, he navigated New York traffic with the confidence of a man who thought the city itself bowed to his presence. The leather seats carried the scent of wealth, the dashboard gleamed with polished chrome, and his hands rested casually on the wheel, a diamond ring flashing under the city lights. When people glanced at him from the sidewalks, Richard imagined admiration in their eyes. But beneath this polished exterior was something else, something hidden even from himself. His obsession with image wasn't just pride, it was armor, built layer by layer over old insecurities he had never dared to face. Every new car, every designer suit, every luxury watch served as another shield protecting him from the possibility that deep down he might not be enough. This was the hidden truth behind his confidence, one that even Richard didn't want to admit. That evening, as rain streaked across his windshield, Richard slowed at a red light in a quieter part of the city. His eyes, always sharp to notice the flaws in others, caught sight of a boy on the sidewalk. Thin, shivering, clothes sticking to his skin, the child held a bundle of newspapers close to his chest, as though they were the only thing keeping him warm. His shoes, if they could even be called that, were torn, the soles peeling away, water seeping in with every step. Richard rolled down his window, not out of compassion, but out of curiosity mixed with disdain. "Kid," he said sharply, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "where'd you find those rags you call shoes? A trash can?" He let out a short, cruel laugh, shaking his head as if the sight of poverty was some kind of twisted joke. The boy's eyes flickered with both hurt and defiance. He didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, silent under the rain, his knuckles tightening around the stack of papers. For Richard, silence was confirmation, proof that the boy had no place in his world. For Ethan, silence was survival. In that instant, the two worlds couldn't have been further apart. Richard saw a reminder of everything he despised: weakness, failure, poverty. Ethan, on the other hand, saw a man so blinded by wealth that he couldn't recognize the weight of real struggle. "People like you," Richard muttered, revving the engine as the light turned green, "will never understand what it takes to win." With that, he drove off, the Mercedes gliding forward as if the entire city existed only for him. But arrogance, like a shadow, follows close behind. Richard didn't realize that this single encounter, this brief moment of mockery, would ripple through his night and collide with a truth he could never have imagined. The world he had built so carefully, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, was about to be shaken not by a rival businessman, not by a market crash, but by a boy with broken shoes and a story far more powerful than any fortune. As the city lights blurred past his window and rain tapped against the glass, Richard leaned back in his seat, convinced he had already won at life. What he didn't know was that the real story was only beginning, waiting quietly in the most unexpected place, ready to unravel everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the very meaning of worth. The rain was falling harder now, the kind of steady downpour that soaked through jackets and blurred the glow of streetlights into hazy circles of gold. Richard slowed his car as he turned onto a quieter street, the windshield wipers swiping rhythmically as if marking the beat of the city's restless heart. It was there, at the edge of the sidewalk, that he noticed the boy again. Thin shoulders hunched against the storm, a bundle of newspapers clutched to his chest like a lifeline. Ethan's small frame seemed almost swallowed by the night, but his eyes, wide and determined, carried the weight of someone far older than his years. Richard's first instinct wasn't compassion. It wasn't curiosity either. It was disdain. He rolled down the window, the mechanical hum slicing through the sound of rain. Leaning slightly toward the opening, he let his eyes trace the boy from head to toe, the wet hair sticking to his forehead, the clothes 2 sizes too big, and most of all, the shoes, if they could still be called that. Torn fabric, soles peeling off, water seeping in with every step. To Richard, they weren't a sign of resilience or survival. They were an invitation to ridicule. "Those shoes," Richard scoffed, his voice sharp and cutting. "Tell me, kid, did you dig them out of the trash?" He let out a laugh, the kind of cold laugh that comes from someone who has forgotten what it feels like to struggle. Ethan froze. His knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip on the stack of papers. For a moment, he thought of answering back, of saying something that would prove he wasn't invisible. But the words caught in his throat, stuck between pride and fear. The humiliation burned hotter than the rain soaking his skin, but he knew better than to fight back. In his world, silence was safer. Richard smirked, mistaking the boy's silence for defeat. "That's what I thought," he muttered. "No voice, no value." With that, he leaned back into his seat, satisfied that he had put the child in his place. But if Richard had looked a little closer, if he had seen beyond the ruined shoes and the damp clothes, he might have noticed something else in Ethan's expression. Beneath The shame was defiance, a flicker of dignity refusing to be extinguished. Ethan's lips pressed together, holding back tears, but his eyes didn't waver. They locked onto Richard's with a quiet challenge, as if to say, "You don't know me. You don't know my story." "Why are you doing this?" Ethan finally whispered, his voice trembling but steady enough to be heard over the rain. Richard raised an eyebrow, almost amused by the boy's audacity. "Because life doesn't care about excuses," he replied. "If you can't show success, you don't deserve respect." Those words lingered in the air like poison, heavier than the storm around them. Ethan lowered his gaze, biting his lip to keep from crying. The sting wasn't just in the insult, but in the reminder of how invisible he felt every day. Another face in a city that walked past him without seeing. The traffic light turned green, its reflection shimmering across the wet pavement. Richard pressed the accelerator, leaving Ethan behind as if the moment meant nothing, but to Ethan it meant everything. The cruel laughter would echo in his mind long after the car disappeared, another scar carved into his memory. And yet, scars have a way of shaping us. For Ethan, the humiliation was sharp, but it carried a strange kind of strength too. Each time the world tried to push him lower, he found a way to stand a little taller inside himself, even if his body betrayed the exhaustion of the streets. For Richard, however, the encounter was already fading into the background. To him, it was just another reminder of the city's failures, another excuse to confirm his belief that poverty was the result of weakness. He turned up the heat in the car, adjusted the cuffs of his designer shirt, and drove on, convinced that the story was already over. But the truth was that the story had only just begun. The rain, the broken shoes, the silent challenge in a child's eyes. These were not random details of a fleeting night. They were threads, weaving themselves into a larger pattern that Richard could not yet see. And the pattern would lead him somewhere he never expected, somewhere that would confront not just his wealth or his pride, but the very foundation of who he thought he was. The city lights blurred past his windows, neon signs glowing against the wet glass, but in the quiet corners of Richard's mind, Ethan's face lingered longer than he wanted to admit. Something about the boy's silence, something about the steadiness in those tired eyes, unsettled him. He shook it off quickly, convincing himself it was nothing. He had business meetings, investments, a world of luxury waiting for him. What could a child in broken shoes possibly matter to a man like him? Yet as the night pressed forward and the rain fell heavier, that unspoken question began to echo more loudly in the spaces Richard tried so hard to ignore. Night in the city didn't end for Ethan when the streets emptied. It only changed shape. After Richard's car vanished into the rain, he tucked the newspapers under his arm and made his way toward the shelter on East 12th, counting steps like he was counting breath. The shelter wasn't home. Home had a front door that remembered your touch and a window that knew your face, but it was a place with rules and warmth and a bunk if he arrived before curfew. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and wet coats. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a steady hum that felt like survival. "You're late," the volunteer at the desk said, but her voice softened when she saw the soaked papers. "We've got soup, kid. Eat before lights out." Ethan nodded, swallowing pride with gratitude. He ate slowly, spoon tracing circles in a bowl that seemed too big for his hands. Across the room, a TV with no sound flashed headlines about markets and politics, a different universe. He watched the faces on the screen, polished, assured, and wondered how a person learned to look that certain. He thought about the way Richard had stared at him, like he was a stain on the glass of the world. The words still hung in the space behind his ribs, heavy but familiar. "You don't deserve respect." It wasn't the first time he'd heard that kind of judgment, just the latest voice to confirm a story he refused to believe. "Keep your head down," an older man at his table murmured, tapping 2 fingers against the formica. "Keep moving. Make one good decision at a time." Ethan looked up. The man's eyes were tired, but kind. "Names?" "In Carl," he added. Used to frame houses in Jersey. Things fell apart. They do, then they don't. Ethan wanted to ask how long it took for things to not fall apart, but he kept the question to himself. "I'm Ethan," he said instead. When he finished the soup, he wrapped the remaining newspapers in a plastic bag the volunteer found behind the desk. "Try the subway entrance on 8th tomorrow," she suggested. "Morning rush? Better chance?" Ethan nodded again. Small tips were like small lights. You held them close. Upstairs, the dorm hummed with soft snores and shifting mattresses. He lay on the bottom bunk and stared at the metal slats above him, counting each one like a promise. His shoes, stripped and drying near the radiator, looked almost relieved to rest. He didn't cry. He'd done that on other nights, on colder nights, and he knew tears solved nothing. Instead, he spoke quietly to the ceiling. "I'll do better tomorrow," he said. "I will." He pictured himself selling out the stack by noon, saving enough for new laces, maybe a thrift store sweatshirt without holes. He pictured the kind of future that needed imagining to stay alive. A small room with a lock, a folded blanket that was his alone, a kitchen with cereal in the cabinet that didn't belong to anyone else. Hope wasn't a luxury here, it was a practice. It was mindset as medicine. Meanwhile, high above the park, Richard stood in front of a mirror in his walk-in closet, the size of some studio apartments. He was drying a suit. Jacket the rain had kissed, considering whether the fabric would hold the crease he demanded. The closet lights were warm and intentional, shining on ranks of ties like ribbons of authority. His world was curated, a behind-the-scenes system of control, where everything he touched proved he had won. He poured a single malt into cut crystal, the cube clinking like applause. When the rain had pelted his windshield earlier, he'd thought of the markets again, volatility humming like a challenge. He preferred challenges he could crush. Human need was not a problem he felt obligated to solve. It was background noise he had trained himself to ignore. He loosened his cufflinks and thought of the boy, but only for a second. "No voice, no value," he had said, a line he believed as doctrine. "I worked for this. Anyone can." It sounded like fairness to him, an equal opportunity gospel polished by success. He did not think about luck or timing, or the hidden truth of where leverage begins. He did not think about the nights he'd had a father to bail him out of early mistakes, or an aunt who co-signed a lease when the numbers didn't quite add up. He had turned those details into grit in his personal myth, and grit had turned into a shield. If he admitted that other people were carrying heavier loads than he ever had, the story of his triumph felt smaller, and he could not bear smaller, not after spending a lifetime inflating every signal of his worth. Down on East 12th, lights clicked off, one row at a time. Ethan slid his hands under the thin pillow and touched the paper bag beside him, as if the newspapers themselves were a promise not to disappear. "Tomorrow," he whispered. "It's just a journey, one decision at a time." That was how he kept going. Decisions like stepping stones, small, deliberate, stubborn against the current. His mother used to say that word, stubborn, as though it were a flaw that could be tuned into purpose. He held on to it now. Stubborn can save you, he told himself. Rain washed the city clean and then began again. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. In Richard's kitchen, marble gleamed under recessed lights. The dishwasher hummed, swallowing crystal and porcelain without complaint. He texted his assistant a list for morning, confirm the term sheet, push the luncheon, send flowers to a donor he didn't particularly like but needed. He moved through tasks like a general charting a campaign, each decision reinforcing the fortress of his certainty. In his phone's reflection, he caught his own smile, practiced and impeccable. "Winning," he said softly, and liked how the word sounded in an empty room. The distance between those rooms, the dorm and the penthouse, was only a handful of miles, but it might as well have been two separate countries with different laws of gravity. Ethan learned to carry everything he owned because things had a way of vanishing. Richard learned to put his name on everything he wanted because nothing was supposed to vanish from him. Ethan's journey required humility simply to survive. Richard's required pride to maintain momentum. One boy was mapping routes between shelters and subway stations. One man was mapping strategies between mergers and charity galas that doubled as networking rituals. Morning came like a quiet negotiation. Ethan queued for the shower and stood under water that ran lukewarm, then cold, counting 5 seconds for each shoulder, 5 for his neck, 5 for his face. He tied his shoes with careful hands, straightening the frayed laces as if they were silk. "They'll hold," he told himself. "They always do." He slung the papers over his shoulder and half-jogged toward 8th, the volunteer's advice ringing like possibility. On the corner, steam rose from a manhole like the city was exhaling. He found a spot where people clustered before the crosswalk and lifted a paper, voice steady. Headlines, $2. Real stories, fresh print. A woman in a navy coat stopped, glanced at the paper, and handed him a 5 without meeting his eyes. "Keep the change," she said. He tucked the bills into his pocket and nodded his thanks, grateful for the tiny impact of a stranger's decision. Across town, Richard dressed in slate grey, the fabric catching the light with quiet authority. His watch felt heavy and reassuring. The elevator whispered him to the lobby, where a doorman greeted him by name, the kind of reverence he expected as baseline. In the car, he reviewed talking points for a morning pitch, then drifted to the rain-soaked memory of the boy without meaning to. "Where'd you find those rags?" he had said. And the echo arrived with a faint sting he didn't care to examine. He dismissed it the way he dismissed delays and doubts, a glitch to be smoothed by momentum. "Mindset," he told himself. "Forward, always forward." But even a well-oiled story collects dust in its corners. In the rear view, the city framed itself in layers. Old brick beside glass, scaffolding beside boutiques, forgotten history pressed against future money. Richard liked the future because it obeyed plans. The past was trickier, full of rooms he preferred to keep locked. Sometimes, late at night, he would remember his mother's voice describing the neighborhood she grew up in, a block where neighbors knocked on one another's doors, where you learned names with your hands as you carried groceries up narrow stairs. He didn't visit that part of town anymore. "Some journeys don't need revisiting," he'd say when his driver took a wrong turn. That was a decision too. At lunchtime, Ethan counted his earnings and calculated quietly. Enough for socks if he found a sale, enough for a sandwich and maybe an apple. He ate on a bench with the newspapers beside him, reading headlines aloud in a soft voice, as if practicing for a different version of himself. "Education reform," he said, tasting the words. "Mentorship programs." He'd seen a flyer at the shelter about an evening workshop where volunteers taught how to write resumes. He couldn't imagine what his resume would say, but he kept the flyer folded in his pocket anyway. "Transformation doesn't announce itself," he said under his breath. "It sneaks in, small." Richard took lunch in a private club, where the lighting made everyone look important. He nodded through brief conversations that were actually negotiations in disguise. When a partner congratulated him on a recent acquisition, he felt the usual surge of pride. He had built a life where compliments confirmed the narrative, yet a sliver of irritation crept in uninvited, the memory of rain on glass, a silent boy refusing to flinch. He found himself annoyed that the image lingered. "The city is full of stories like that," he told a colleague when the conversation drifted to homelessness. "You can't fix everything," his colleague agreed quickly. That was the social script. Still, the agreement didn't settle the unease. Afternoon tilted. Toward evening, traffic threading itself into red lines on Richard's navigation screen. He turned down a side street to avoid a delay and passed an old brick building with a familiar stoop, a relic from his mother's early years. He almost didn't notice the tug in his chest, that tiny pull that memories make when they smell something they recognize. He softened the accelerator without meaning to. The building's windows were narrower than he remembered. The stoop, smaller. He imagined a little girl with a ribbon in her hair running down those steps, but the image didn't belong to him. It belonged to the stories his mother told. He shook off the feeling, fingers tightening on the wheel. "Focus," he said. Decisions. On 8th, Ethan packed his remaining papers and headed south, the city cooling into a purple dusk that makes everything look temporary. He passed a bakery dumping day-old bread into bins and waited, then asked shyly if he could take a loaf. The clerk nodded. Take 2, kid. Ethan felt a strange flicker of abundance carrying both, like he was smuggling warmth back to the shelter for whoever needed it. Thank you, he said, meeting the clerk's eyes with the steady courtesy he offered to people who still remembered how to see. Evening finally settled. In the shelter's common room, a volunteer plugged in a string of mismatched lamps to soften the harsh light. Carl was there again, humming a tune that drifted over the clatter of trays. You sell out? He asked. Almost, Ethan said. Tomorrow will be better. He meant it. He always meant it. He placed one of the loaves on the table between them, a small treaty against scarcity, and the men around them tore pieces with quiet reverence. For a moment, the room felt like a family that had borrowed itself from strangers. Across town, Richard parked in his mother's garage, the concrete echoing under slow footsteps. He carried a bag of her favorite biscotti and a bottle of tea she liked. In the elevator up to her apartment, he smoothed his tie and adjusted his expression into the smile she loved. His mother had a way of dissolving the hard lines of his day. She had a way of telling stories that made the past sound like a map you could still follow. When she opened the door, he kissed her cheek and breathed in the familiar scent of lavender and old books. You look tired, she said, brushing a crumb from his lapel. I'm winning, he replied with a half grin, then, without warning, thought of the boy. Again, the image arrived with rain clinging to it. He set the bag on the counter and let the conversation move to safer ground, but the feeling didn't entirely leave. After dinner, while his mother made tea, Richard wandered to the bookshelf that had anchored the living room for decades. There were framed photographs between novels and travel guides, a collage of lives remembered. In the corner, a small leather-bound book rested on a stack. He ran a finger over its spine, recognizing it not as an object, but as a presence he'd known since childhood. His mother's writing lived there, birthdays, prayers, recipes, names. He picked it up the way one picks up a memory that has started knocking, not to finish anything, just to see what was waiting on the first page that would open. Richard set the biscotti beside the kettle and followed his mother into the living room, the way he'd done since he was a boy who believed the world began and ended on this Persian rug. The apartment felt like a museum of gentle things, lamps that cast amber halos, quilts folded with care, a bowl of seashells from summers that smelled like sunscreen and salt. His mother, Margaret, moved slowly now, illness turning each step into a small negotiation. Still, she carried a quiet authority that didn't need volume. Sit, she said, patting the edge of the couch. You always rush through your victories. Let them sit in the room a minute. He smiled at that, loosening his tie as steam rose from the kettle like a curtain. He watched her pour chamomile into wide-mouthed cups, hands thinned but steady. For a moment, he felt the old safety that came from the ritual, tea, stories, the soft clicking of a clock that had measured their years together. She asked the usual questions, and he gave the usual answers. How was the meeting? Good. Are you sleeping? Enough? You're taking care of yourself? I'm winning, he said, almost out of habit, the line he used when he didn't want to touch the softer parts of truth. She gave him a look that wasn't unkind but wasn't fooled either. Winning is loud, she said. Peace is quiet. When the tea settled and the room exhaled, Margaret rested her head against a small pillow and closed her eyes. Just a moment, she said. I'll listen with my eyes closed. He nodded, glancing around the room the way you scan a skyline for reference points. His gaze found the bookshelf that had anchored every apartment they'd ever had, a scaffolding of memory. Spines, worn by thumbs, travel guides annotated in pencil, a church bulletin pressed like a leaf between novels. He drifted toward it, drawn by a gravity he preferred to ignore. On the second shelf, sitting on a stack of recipe cards and a faded map of Cape Cod, was the old leather diary, brown, scuffed, threaded at the corners, the sort of object that remembers everything it touches. He picked it up without ceremony. He'd seen her write in it for years, notes to herself, names of people she was afraid to forget, prayers written like letters. It wasn't his habit to pry, but Margaret had always left it in plain sight, and he had convinced himself that proximity was permission. Just to straighten the papers, he told himself when he was younger, moving it from table to shelf. Just to dust around it. Now, he let the cover fall open as casually as flipping a magazine in a waiting room. Mindset, unbothered, posture, composed, the behind-the-scenes truth. Something in him wanted to be surprised and resisted it at the same time. The first pages were what he expected. Shopping lists written in tidy loops, a reminder to call Aunt Rose, a note about the neighbor's cat that had found its way onto the fire escape last winter. There were recipes written like spells. Cinnamon exactly this much, patience exactly that much. Stir until the mixture remembers home. He smiled despite himself. Margaret wrote about food the way other people wrote about philosophy. A few pages later, he found names he recognized and dates that pinned memories to calendars. A school play where he'd been a tree with 2 lines, the day his first promotion arrived, like a coronation. His mother's script made each moment look inevitable, like a journey that had always known its map. He glanced at the couch. Margaret's chest rose and fell with the unhurried rhythm of shallow sleep. He turned another page, and the tone shifted. Not the handwriting. The tilt was the same, but the temperature of the words cooled into something more private. "Today the rain would not stop," she had written. "I thought of a different rain years ago, and the boy who stood in it without an umbrella." Richard felt a small tug, the faintest pull a memory makes when it realizes you're listening. He flattened the page with his palm. "Some decisions," the next line read, "never leave the rooms we make them in. They ask to be carried." He told himself he wasn't hunting for anything, that this was idle curiosity in the lull between conversations, but he knew better. He was a man who loved control, and the diary was a door to a part of his life he did not control. It held the hidden truth of his mother's interior world, her private weather, her quiet revelations. He turned another page. There were notes about church volunteers and a list of books to gift the children in the building, then a paragraph that paused, turned back, and tried again, the ink a little darker, as if the decision to write had taken effort. "You do not repair the past," Margaret had written. "You love it until it teaches you how to live with it." Richard cleared his throat without meaning to. He wasn't sentimental. That was the story he told himself when sentiment threatened to rearrange his priorities. He let the diary balance against his knee and listened for the kettle's settling tick, for any sound that would return the room to neutral. None came. Only the clock, only his own breath, only the soft patience of a room that had watched him grow colder and kinder in uneven measures. "It's just a notebook," he whispered and flipped again. A grocery list, a doctor's appointment, a quote she'd copied from a book on forgiveness, then a memory he didn't recognize. "The winter the heat went out on Birch Street," she wrote. "I learned the impact of warmed hands wrapped around a paper cup. Not charity, dignity. Hot chocolate taught me a gospel I hadn't heard in church." He frowned, trying to place Birch Street, then realized he had only ever heard the name in family stories, places that existed like fables to explain resilience. He could see his mother as a young woman in that paragraph, shoulders squared against a wind that taught posture to everyone who walked into it. He turned the page and encountered a photograph sleeve, the corner of something glossy peeking out like a secret that hadn't decided whether to reveal itself. He paused. For a long second, he simply stared at the edge of the photo, the way a person hovers at the threshold of a room where the lighting is soft and full of old voices. "Don't be dramatic," he told himself, but his thumb hesitated. He didn't know why, not consciously. He had been the man who scoffed at hesitation that afternoon, who wielded decisions like instruments of power. Yet here, the smallest motion, the lift of a paper edge, felt like a lever that could shift the floor beneath him. On the couch, Margaret stirred, then settled. "Are you reading my chicken scratch?" she asked without opening her eyes. "It's half soup recipes," he smiled, "and half philosophy," he said. "You've always been sneaky with your wisdom." Her lips curved. "You weren't ready for it all at once." He closed the diary a moment, palming the cover as if to contain its gravity. "I wasn't ready for a lot of things," he said, softer than he intended. He wasn't sure whether he meant the afternoon, the boy in the rain, or a past that kept sending messages through ordinary objects. He reopened to the same page. There was no hiding from a pull that clear, and slipped the photo halfway out. The gloss caught the lamplight. The image formed slowly, the way a memory returns in pieces. At first, he only registered rain, a street, blurred, a hand reaching. Whose hand, he couldn't tell. Then the outline of a face in the bottom corner, small, and turned slightly away, like the camera had caught someone mid-step. The paper's edge was frayed, where it had been handled more times than the surrounding pages. He could feel finger-worn softness along the border, evidence that this moment had mattered to someone enough to be visited often. He swallowed, unsure why his mouth had gone dry. The impact of the afternoon played behind his eyes. The boy's silence, the defiant steadiness in the middle of humiliation, the way rain flattens sound until all you hear is what you've refused to hear for years. "Why does this feel familiar?" he murmured to no one. He looked over at his mother. She had opened her eyes now, and was watching him without urgency, the way you watch a person approach a truth you can't carry for them. "If you're tired, we can—" he started, then stopped. He had meant to offer an exit, and realized none was needed. Margaret shifted, the pillow rustling beneath her cheek. "The diary helps me remember the parts that matter," she said. "Not headlines, not trophies, the moments that changed the size of my heart." He nodded, fingers still pressed to the photo's edge. He thought about size, of penthouses, of closets, of a watch face that made his wrist feel armored. He had measured life in square footage and market share. Here, his mother measured in transformations, tiny expansions that no one applauded, but that rearranged how a person stood in the world. "Mindset is a map," she added, eyes drifting closed again. "You think you're choosing roads, but half the time the roads are choosing you." He didn't answer. His throat ached with a kind of restraint he didn't recognize. Inside his chest, something slow and stubborn was shifting, not a collapse but an adjustment, an awareness that pulled like a tide against the walls he had built. He slid the photo a little farther free, breath catching at the shape he could now see, the suggestion of small shoulders in a jacket too thin, a face tilted toward someone taller, just outside the frame. A story was embedded in the angle alone, in the deference of the posture, in the courage of simply existing where kindness was not guaranteed. He wanted to pretend the page didn't matter, that all photographs from the past were equal, that no hidden truth waited here with the patience of a kept promise. But the room had changed. He could feel it, not the furniture, the air. Revelations don't always announce themselves with lightning. Sometimes they rearrange oxygen, and suddenly breathing feels like a new skill. He glanced at the clock and then back to the image, as if time could negotiate with recognition. It couldn't. Not tonight. "Mom," he said, and heard how different his voice sounded, stripped of its usual polish. "Do you remember this day?" She opened her eyes fully, searching his face before she looked down at the diary in his hands. "I remember the weather," she said quietly. "I remember the way rain chooses certain streets and avoids others." He waited. She didn't rush. She never had, not with the things that mattered. "Some days," she added, "the city teaches you what kind of person you've decided to be." He looked, again, at the photograph, at the near picture that asked to be named. The kettle clicked in the kitchen like a distant metronome. Beyond the windows, the city moved through its evening, sirens and buses, and a distant laugh that rose and faded. Richard breathed in, breathed out, and understood that the next inch of glossy paper would not just show him a scene, it would show him a choice he had been postponing for years. He braced his thumb against the edge, and the page, obedient and ordinary, began to give. Richard slid the photograph fully from its sleeve, and for a moment his breath refused to cooperate. The image was soft at the edges, the colors dulled with age, but the face at its center burned sharper than anything else in the room. It was Ethan, the same boy he had mocked on the rainy street only hours earlier, the same eyes that had looked at him with defiance wrapped in silence. Richard blinked hard, as if his vision had played a trick, but the truth remained fixed on glossy. A paper, the worn shoes, the thin jacket, the fragile posture, it was all there. "No," Richard muttered, shaking his head. "This can't be right. How could this poor child be in my mother's diary?" His voice cracked, not with emotion he wanted to admit, but with a confusion that clawed at the edges of his certainty. He glanced at his mother, who was watching him now, not startled, but with the calm of someone who had carried a truth for years. Margaret didn't rush to speak. She let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel the weight of it. Finally, she said softly, "You've seen him, haven't you?" Richard's mouth went dry. I saw a boy tonight, yes. But this—" He lifted the photo in disbelief, his hand trembling despite his effort to control it. "This is the same boy, the same face. Mother, what is going on?" Margaret adjusted the pillow behind her back, her eyes searching his like a doctor examining a wound. "I always knew the day would come," she whispered. "The day when a hidden truth would no longer stay hidden." She reached for the diary, turning the page with a care that suggested reverence, not fear. "I wrote it down because memory fades, and I could not let his story vanish completely." Richard leaned closer, scanning the handwritten lines that unfurled across the page. The entry was dated more than a decade earlier. The ink, though faint, carried the urgency of a confession. "A child was left at the church steps today. A boy, so small, so hungry, so forgotten by the world. I brought him inside, wrapped him in the blanket I had carried from home. I fed him, held him, and for a few short months I believed I could give him something close to a family." Richard swallowed hard. The words pressed against him like a tide. "You cared for him? You mean this boy, Ethan?" His mother nodded slowly. "Yes. His name was given later, but when I held him I called him by nothing more than my little one. He was your sister's child, Richard. She was young, frightened, and lost to her own battles. She disappeared before I could reach her, and then, one night, he was gone too. The state took him, shuffled him between places, and I was told I had no right to claim him. I was powerless." Richard stared at her, his grip on the photograph tightening as though it might vanish if he let go. His pulse hammered in his temples. "My sister's child. That boy is family." The word tasted foreign, impossible, yet undeniable. "Yes," Margaret whispered, her eyes shining. "Your nephew." The room seemed to tilt. Richard pressed his palm against the armrest to steady himself, but it didn't help. His mind replayed the scene in the rain, the smirk on his lips, the cruelty in his tone, the way Ethan's silence had cut deeper than he realized. He had looked at the boy as if he were nothing, but he wasn't nothing. He was blood. He was kin. "I mocked him," Richard whispered, the words barely audible. "I mocked him, Mother. I laughed at his shoes. His shoes." He buried his face in his hands, shame rising like fire under his skin. Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling but firm, as they brushed his wrist. "You didn't know. But knowing now means you must decide who you are." The diary lay open between them, its pages like an indictment, its lines like a map, pointing to the transformation waiting ahead. Richard looked at the photograph again, and this time the details stabbed sharper than before. The weariness in Ethan's eyes, the strength hidden in his thin frame, the quiet resilience that had survived years of neglect. Every story Richard had told himself about worth, about success, about failure, suddenly they all fractured under the weight of this revelation. His mindset, built like steel, cracked with a sound he could feel more than hear. This wasn't a rival he could outmaneuver or a deal he could renegotiate. This was blood. This was destiny, a truth that carried the impact of all his decisions and all his blindness. Margaret spoke again, her voice low but steady. "I prayed you would find him. Not like this, not with cruelty, but with recognition. Sometimes, Richard, the city arranges meetings our hearts aren't ready for. But once it happens, you can't undo it. You can only decide what kind of man you will be from this moment forward." He sat back, staring at the ceiling as though the answer might be etched there. His entire journey, every expensive suit, every calculated decision, every display of arrogance, felt suddenly hollow, stripped of its armor. What mattered now wasn't power or prestige, but a boy who had waited too long for someone to claim him. The photograph trembled in his hands as he whispered, "I saw him tonight, Mother. I left him standing in the rain." Margaret closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "Then you know where to find him." Richard clutched the diary to his chest, his thoughts colliding like storm clouds. The boy's silence, his defiance, his pain, it all made sense now, stitched together by the threads of family he never knew existed. And in that moment, as the city outside carried on with its restless rhythm, Richard understood that his life was no longer his alone. A hidden truth had stepped into the light, and it demanded a response that would change everything. He looked again at the photograph, unable to tear his eyes away. The rain outside tapped the windows in steady rhythm, echoing the memory of that night. Somewhere in the city, Ethan was still out there, waiting, unaware of the revelation that had just rewritten both their stories. Richard sat frozen, the photo trembling in his hands like it might dissolve if he held it any tighter. The storm inside him was louder than the rain outside. He had mocked Ethan, treated him as though he were nothing more than a shadow on the street, and yet here was the undeniable truth staring back at him. That boy was not a stranger. He was blood. His mother's eyes opened fully now, steady but tired, carrying the weight of years. "Richard," she said softly, "I need you to listen without interruption. This is not easy for me, but it has waited long enough." Her voice had the cadence of confession, but it wasn't guilt that shaped it. It was the urgency of a truth she could no longer protect with silence. Richard leaned forward, his chest tight. "Tell me, who is he? Why was his face in your diary?" Margaret exhaled slowly, as if every word required strength. "Ethan is the son of your half-sister, Claire. You remember her name, though perhaps not her story." At the mention of Claire, Richard's brow furrowed. The name rang faintly, a shadow from a past he had never bothered to untangle. He searched his memory, but found only fragments. His mother's brief silences at holidays, the way certain subjects were avoided like fragile glass. "Claire," he repeated, as though testing the sound of a ghost. Margaret nodded. "Yes, she was my child before your father, born in a time when I was still finding my footing. In this city, she was fiery, stubborn, full of life, but also reckless. When she grew older, the weight of her decisions pulled her away from us. She disappeared from our lives, carrying burdens she never shared. Years passed, and I received only scattered notes, short calls, then nothing." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the diary. "When I learned she had died, it was already too late. She had left behind a child, Ethan. But by the time I discovered him, he was already entangled in the system, moving between strangers, living in places no child should ever have to call home." Richard's throat tightened. The polished surface of his life suddenly cracked, revealing a behind-the-scenes history he had never been told. "And you knew all this time? You knew there was a boy?" "I knew," she admitted, her eyes glistening. "And I tried to bring him into our lives. I fought, but the court said I had no standing. I was told it was better for him to remain where he was. I visited when I could, brought what I could, but the doors kept closing. In the end, all I had were memories, scraps and prayers. That's why I wrote it all down, so he would not vanish, even if the world forgot him. Richard's voice cracked. So the child I mocked, the child I humiliated on the street, is my nephew, my own flesh and blood. The words cut deeper as he spoke them, each syllable stripping him of the armor he had worn for years. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. Yes, Richard, he is your family. He carries our story, our name, even if he doesn't know it yet. He pushed back in his chair, running a hand over his face, as if the motion could wipe away the shame. His mind replayed the image of Ethan's soaked clothes, the newspapers clutched to his chest, the silent defiance in his eyes. He had laughed at him, laughed at the very child his mother had once cradled, laughed at his sister's son. The impact of the revelation pressed on him with unbearable weight. How could I have been so blind? He whispered, his voice breaking. I looked at him and saw only poverty. I didn't see him. I didn't even try. Margaret leaned forward, her frail hand resting gently on his. Blindness is not permanent, Richard. The world has ways of opening our eyes when it matters most. What you do next will determine whether this moment breaks you or transforms you. Her words cut through the fog, striking something deeper than shame. This wasn't just about a cruel remark in the rain, it was about a decision that would shape the rest of his journey. He could walk away, hide behind pride, and let Ethan remain unseen, or he could face the hidden truth, embrace it, and allow it to transform not only Ethan's life, but his own. Richard stared again at the photograph, the boy's face etched into his mind. The arrogance he had carried for years felt suddenly hollow, a mask shattered by the weight of one revelation. The decisions that had once seemed so important, deals, suits, appearances, now felt irrelevant. Against the reality of a boy who bore his family's blood, a boy who had endured hardship while Richard lived in abundance. I saw him tonight, Mother, he said quietly, guilt spilling into every word. He was standing in the rain, selling newspapers. I left him there. Margaret closed her eyes, pain flickering across her face. Then perhaps grace has given you a second chance. You crossed paths for a reason, Richard. Some meetings are not coincidences. They are corrections. Her words hung in the air, heavy yet alive, like a compass waiting to be followed. Richard sat in silence, the photograph trembling in his hand, the diary open on the table like an unspoken command. The storm outside pressed against the windows, but it was nothing compared to the storm within him. Somewhere in the city, Ethan was still walking those streets, unaware of the revelations unfolding in this quiet apartment. And Richard, for the first time in his life, understood that the next step he took would matter. More than any step he had ever taken before. Richard remained seated, his elbows pressed into his knees, the photograph dangling loosely between his fingers. The leather diary still lay open on the table, its words whispering a history he had never cared to ask about. For a man who had spent his entire adult life controlling the narrative, this was the first time the story controlled him. He replayed every detail of that rainy encounter with Ethan, the sharpness of his laugh, the contempt in his tone, the way the boy's silence had cut through the storm more than any words could have. Shame crept in like an unwelcome guest, filling his chest until it was hard to breathe. I called him worthless, Richard muttered, his voice breaking against the weight of the confession. I looked at my own nephew, my sister's child, and I told him he had no value. He pressed his palms to his eyes, but the image of Ethan wouldn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper, eyes that refused to surrender, shoes, crumbling at the seams, yet still carrying him forward. The boy had dignity even in misery, while Richard, clothed in wealth, had acted like a beggar of pride. Margaret's voice was soft, but it carried the precision of truth. Arrogance always blinds us to what matters most. The hidden truth is that you weren't mocking Ethan, Richard. You were mocking the parts of yourself you've spent your whole life trying to bury. Her words landed with impact, stripping away the last shield he had left. Richard leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be etched into the plaster. He thought of every decision he had made, every deal that had brought him here, every carefully curated image he presented to the world. All of it seemed suddenly fragile, like glass that could shatter with one stone of reality. He stood abruptly, pacing across the room. The polished shoes he wore clicked against the hardwood floor with an insistence that made him wince. They reminded him of Ethan's. Shoes, broken, waterlogged, barely held together. How could two pairs of shoes tell such different stories? One screamed privilege, the other survival. Yet both now stood in the same family. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I don't even know where to begin." Margaret's gaze followed him, steady, unshaken. "Begin by deciding who you want to be. Your reputation, your wealth, your power, those are masks. But character, Richard, character is the face underneath. You can choose pride or you can choose redemption. That's the conflict only you can resolve." Her words sliced through his defenses. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, the storm pressing against his back, forcing him to decide whether to step into the unknown or cling to the safety of a crumbling ledge. He thought of the boardrooms where he had boasted of his strategies, of the friends who admired his decisiveness, of the magazines that praised his success. What would they say if they knew he had family on the streets, a boy whose existence he had denied not by ignorance alone, but by cruelty? The thought of humiliation gnawed at him. His reputation was a fortress he had built brick by brick, and this revelation threatened to tear it down. He imagined headlines, "Business tycoon linked to homeless child," and felt the familiar fear of exposure. To protect himself, all he had to do was remain silent, walk away, pretend Ethan was just another face in the crowd. That was the easier choice, the safer choice, the choice that aligned with the man he had always been. But then another image broke through, Ethan's eyes, steady in the rain, unyielding even under insult. Richard realized the boy had more strength in that moment than he himself had ever shown. It was resilience born from hardship, dignity carved out of suffering, the kind of strength that no money could buy. Richard, for all his wealth, had crumbled in the face of truth, while Ethan, with nothing, had stood tall. The contrast burned him. "I can't undo what I said," Richard whispered almost to himself. "I can't take back the way I looked at him." His hands tightened into fists. "But maybe I can choose differently now." Margaret's eyes softened, though her words remained firm. "Guilt can paralyze, Richard, or it can transform. You must decide whether tonight becomes your shame or your turning point." He stopped pacing, staring at the photograph once more. Ethan's face seemed to look straight through him, asking without words, "What will you do with this truth?" Richard felt his arrogance crumble entirely in that moment, reduced to rubble under the weight of responsibility. He knew that protecting his reputation would be the death of his soul, while facing the truth, however painful, might just save it. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, the storm outside louder. Yet within that chaos, Richard sensed a path emerging. Not clear, not easy, but real. It was a path that demanded humility, a quality he had abandoned long ago. He drew a deep breath, the kind you take before stepping into uncharted territory. His mother's diary remained open on the table, the inked lines shining faintly under the lamp. The words were more than memories. They were instructions written in love, waiting for him to act. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a new clarity. He understood now that the next decision he made would not be about business or reputation. It would be about family, redemption, and the kind of man he chose to become when no one else was watching. Outside, the storm began to ease, the rain softening into a steady drizzle. Richard set the photograph gently back on the page, as if to promise he would not ignore it again. Somewhere in the city, Ethan was still out there, unaware that the uncle he had never known was standing on the edge of transformation, caught between pride and redemption, ready to decide which voice he would listen to. The morning broke with a clarity Richard hadn't felt in years. The storm had washed the city clean, leaving the streets glistening under a pale sun that seemed to demand honesty. He hadn't slept much. Fragments of his mother's words and the photograph had replayed in his mind all night, like a truth he could no longer ignore. For once, his schedule, his meetings, his empire of obligations, all of it felt secondary. He knew exactly where he needed to be. Driving through the city, Richard's eyes searched the sidewalks with an intensity that surprised him. He wasn't looking at buildings or traffic or the polished faces of executives hurrying to work. He was looking for Ethan. Every corner, every crosswalk, every alley held the possibility of recognition. It wasn't long before he spotted him near the subway entrance on 8th Avenue, the same bundle of newspapers clutched to his chest, his thin frame braced against the morning chill. Richard parked his car and stepped out, his polished shoes striking the pavement with a weight that no longer felt like armor. For the first time, he approached not as a man of wealth, but as a man stripped of pride, walking toward a boy he had once dismissed. Ethan looked up warily, his eyes narrowing with recognition. He stiffened, as though preparing for another insult, another sting. Richard's throat tightened. He had spoken 1,000 apologies in boardrooms, crafted polished lines to salvage deals, but never had words felt so heavy, so necessary. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself onto one knee so that his gaze met Ethan's at eye level. The movement startled the boy, who instinctively took a step back. "I was wrong," Richard said, his voice steady but laced with humility. "I spoke to you yesterday like you were less than me. I mocked you when I should have seen you, and I can't take that back. But I can tell you the truth. You matter, more than I realized, more than I wanted to admit." Ethan stared at him, suspicion flickering across his face. "Why are you saying this now? People like you don't care, not about me." His voice was flat, but beneath it lingered the ache of someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Richard swallowed hard. "Because I learned something last night. Something that changed everything. You're not just another face on the street. You're family, Ethan. My family." The words tasted strange, but they felt true, heavier than gold. Ethan's grip on the newspapers loosened, confusion softening. The lines of his face. "Family," he whispered, as if the word itself might vanish if he spoke it too loudly. "Yes," Richard said, his chest tightening. "You are my sister's son, my nephew, and I failed you before I even knew you. But if you'll let me, I want to make it right." The boy didn't answer immediately. He searched Richard's face for lies, for cracks, for the arrogance he had seen before. But what he found was different. Rawness, vulnerability, the kind of truth that doesn't hide behind wealth. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to hope that maybe this man wasn't just another stranger. Richard extended his hand, not as a demand, but as an offering. Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached out, his fingers small and rough against Richard's steady palm. It was a simple touch, but it carried the impact of a bridge being built where only distance had existed before. "Come with me," Richard said softly. "Not because I pity you, but because you belong with me. You deserve more than this street, more than scraps. You deserve shoes that carry you forward, food that fills you, a bed that is yours. And most of all, you deserve family." Ethan's eyes filled, though he tried to blink the tears away. "And if I don't fit in your world?" he asked. Richard shook his head, his grip firm on the boy's hand. "Then I'll change my world until you do." The weight of those words seemed to settle into Ethan's chest. For years he had lived in a cycle of temporary shelters and fleeting kindness, never certain of where he belonged. And here was a man who had once mocked him, now offering not charity but connection, an anchor he had longed for without even realizing it. Richard led him toward the car, not with the arrogance of a man displaying ownership, but with the tenderness of someone reclaiming what was lost. He opened the door and watched Ethan climb in, the boy's eyes darting around the leather interior with cautious wonder. Richard noticed the shoes again, their seams, split and souls flapping, and the sight cut him deeper than any humiliation ever had. At home, Richard guided Ethan inside. The penthouse, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a stage for transformation. He led the boy to the kitchen, placing food on the table. Warm bread, fruit, milk poured into a glass that shone in the morning light. Ethan ate slowly at first, then faster, hunger breaking through the hesitation. Richard watched silently, guilt and hope warring inside him. When Ethan finally leaned back, full for the first time in weeks, Richard set a new pair of shoes on the floor beside him, strong, sturdy, untouched by rain. Ethan's eyes widened, but Richard knelt again, lifting one of the boy's feet gently into his hands. He unlaced the broken shoe and slipped it off, setting it aside with quiet reverence, as though discarding not just leather and fabric, but years of neglect. Then he slid on the new shoe, tying the laces with deliberate care. "There," Richard said softly. "Shoes that fit, shoes that carry you forward." Ethan stared at him, silent but no longer suspicious. The weight of the moment pressed into both of them. A hidden truth revealed, an old arrogance crumbled, and a new journey just beginning. And for Richard, it wasn't just about shoes or food or even shelter. It was about giving Ethan what he had been denied his entire life, the undeniable certainty that he was not alone. Family wasn't a choice anymore. It was a responsibility, a redemption, and a promise Richard intended to keep. The city outside roared with its usual chaos, but inside the apartment, a different rhythm was taking shape. It was the quiet pulse of two lives, once separated by pride and poverty, now bound by blood and the fragile beginnings of trust. Richard knew this was only the first step, the opening of a door into a life he had never imagined living. And as he looked at Ethan, wearing new shoes and holding food in his hands, he understood that redemption was not a destination but a journey he was just beginning to walk. Wealth can buy shoes, Richard thought as he looked at Ethan's feet, now snug inside leather that didn't leak when the rain came. But wealth could never measure the value of a soul. That lesson didn't come from a boardroom or a bank statement. It came from a boy who had survived on scraps of kindness. A boy who had carried dignity through storms most men in suits could never endure. Ethan had no empire to his name, no prestige to lean on. Yet in his silence, in his refusal to crumble under cruelty, he had shown Richard the kind of strength that transforms a heart. The contrast was undeniable. Richard had spent years worshipping appearances, polished watches, tailored jackets, the perfect reflection in a mirror that never told the full story. And yet, in the cracked soles of a child's shoes, he had found a truth that stripped him of every illusion. His arrogance had collapsed, and in its place stood something fragile but real. Humility. For the first time, he understood that value wasn't about power or possessions, but about presence, compassion, and the willingness to carry family even when it complicates your world. Ethan glanced at him across the table, his eyes still cautious but softer now, as if hope had finally been allowed to take its first steps. "Why me?" he asked quietly, voice thin but steady. Richard met his gaze and answered with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "Because you are mine, not mine to own, but mine to protect, mine to walk beside. You are part of me, Ethan, and I won't fail you again." Those words, simple yet unshakable, were more valuable than all the polished speeches Richard had given in his lifetime. They weren't rehearsed, they weren't calculated, they were true. And in that truth, something shifted. The boy wasn't just family by blood. He had become the mirror Richard never wanted to face, and the compass that pointed toward the man he still had a chance to become. Wealth can build towers that touch the sky, but towers crumble without love at their foundation. It can fill closets with shoes, but shoes mean nothing if they never walk the path of compassion. Sometimes, the people we dismiss, the ones we look down on, are the very people who return to us carrying the hidden truth of what matters. And sometimes they are the ones who remind us what love, humility, and family truly mean. Stories like this remind us of the quiet but powerful connections between strangers, the kind of bonds that reveal themselves in the most unexpected moments. A single encounter can carry the impact of a lifetime. A single decision can change a journey forever. And you never really know where life's twists may lead, until they lead you exactly where you were meant to be. And if you've walked with me all the way through this story, it probably stirred something in you too. Maybe it reminded you of a time when a simple encounter shifted the way you saw the world. Or maybe it just left you reflecting on what really matters beneath all the surface noise. If that's the case, let me know in the comments by writing something like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to know who felt this journey as deeply as I did while telling it. If the story connected with you, a quick like on this video goes a long way. It helps keep these kinds of stories alive and make sure they reach more people who might need to hear them at just the right moment. And of course, if you'd like to stay close to stories like this, about hidden truths, second chances, and the kind of transformations that can change a life, subscribing is the best way to do that. And before you go, there's a video right here that complements this one beautifully. Click and continue with me there. I think you'll find it just as meaningful.